Good evening, good evening, good evening. A good vach to you, Shavua Tov. A good week. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us on this Saturday evening as we start a new week? I'm going to call out the names in 1 minute. We were saddened to hear as we came out of Shabbos that the world today lost a great, great Jewish leader, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, left this world today at the age of 72. It's a tremendous loss. We say Baruch Dayan Emes, God is the true judge. And may Rabbi Sacks' memory always be for a blessing. I'm about to share some of Rabbi Sacks' wisdom. Who is with us on this Saturday night? Ed Berg from New Jersey, Yehudit from Florence, South Carolina, Melissa from Great Neck, Ann from Merced, Carl from Atlanta, Jennifer from Florida, Grace from Miami, Beverly and Kelly Joe from Minnesota, and George from Teaneck, John from Sedona, Chaim says a good vach from Charlotte, North Carolina, Peggy from West Virginia, John says shalom, Marion from Long Island, Mark from Columbia, Maryland, Bill Eldridge checking in from Arkansas, where through the power of my new Chromecast, you're coming in on the big screen. I love to hear that, Bill. Bill is with us from Pittsburgh. Michelle holding down the fort in Indiana. Nancy from Southern Pines. Stephanie says Shavua Tov. Yehudit says Amen. Scott BD8 for Rabbi Sacks. Tevi with us from Orlando. Didarul is with us from Dhaka in Bangladesh. Welcome, Didarul. Matt from Eau Claire. Ernesto says rest in peace. Janice from Dallas. Annie's with us from Michigan, Sharon from Lebanon, New Jersey, Philip from Cincinnati, Monty says Shavua Tov from Montreal, Esther from Maine, and JJ from Mumbai in Indiana. Welcome, everybody. It's good to have you with us. All right. On losing Jonathan Sacks, I mean, his thought has been so instrumental in reaching the world with Jewish wisdom and bringing wisdom that touches the heart to people that wouldn't have otherwise have heard it. He was just such a great man. He was a professor of philosophy. He was knighted by the Queen of England. Let me read to you what... This is from a book called Radical Responsibility on the Life and Teachings of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. It says, in describing the quality that makes a Jewish sage, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch writes, it is not by virtue of his knowledge that a man is recognized as being a Jewish sage, and it is not by means of his knowledge that he wins people's hearts to the Torah. The credential for his knowledge is the way he lives. And only a godly way of living earns him the scepter of a herald of the divine world. Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks is recognized around the world as an ambassador for the Jewish people. He has won the hearts of all who hear his words because he embodies the Torah that he teaches, and he lives the divine word whose scepter he holds. His sense of justice excludes no one, and his mission to return those who may be lost includes everyone. With deep respect and admiration, it is my honor to dedicate this article written by Michael Broidy in this book to the chief rabbi. I personally was so moved by Rabbi Sacks. Every time we have several of his books, I've read countless articles by Rabbi Sacks. Often when I'm researching something to discuss here on Accidental Talmudist, I'll go to see what Rabbi Sacks said about the point. The Koran Siddur, the Koran prayer book that I use, has an incredible introduction to prayer generally by Rabbi Sacks. And what was always amazing to me about Rabbi Sacks' teaching is that he would tell you something about a verse in the Torah, about a line from the Psalms, and when you hear what he says, it sounds so foundational, so fundamental to the line that you can't believe you've never heard it before. It's like, well, oh, okay, well that is the most basic meaning, the simplest and yet piercing of the heart, the truest and simplest and most fundamental meaning, and yet I've never heard it before. I never heard it before. Rabbi Sacks had that insight into that bit of Torah, and that experience happens over and over and over again. When you read Rabbi Sacks's commentary on Scripture, before I go on, you should hear just a few words from Rabbi Sacks himself. So here's just a few quotes. Rabbi Sacks speaking. He said, "We should challenge the relativism that tells us there is no right or wrong, when every instinct of our mind knows it is not so, and is a mere excuse to allow us to indulge in what we believe we can get away with. A world without values quickly becomes a world without value." He also said, "The test of faith is whether I can make space for difference. Can I recognize God's image in someone who is not in my image, whose language, faith, ideal are different from mine? If I cannot, then I have made God in my image, instead of allowing the Holy One to remake me in his." And finally, God, said Jonathan, former chief rabbi, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, "God has given us many faiths, but only one world in which to coexist. May our work help all of us to cherish our commonalities and feel enlarged by our differences." May the soul of Rabbi Sacks be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. May his memory always be for a blessing, and may his merit carry him ever higher in the world of souls as we continue to learn from his great teachings, to be inspired by them, and to share them with others. And we say, Amen. All right, where are we holding in our journey through the Talmud? We are in the third volume of the Talmud tractate, Eruvin, and we are on page Tzadi. That is page 90. We're in chapter 9. We're discussing the first Mishna. We're discussing what is the status of roofs, courtyards, and enclosures with respect to carrying on Shabbos, and whether these areas have some kind of a special status with respect to objects that begin in them, and with respect to carrying through them. We know we've talked so much about that we have to create an Eruv in order to carry objects from our houses into a shared courtyard, or from a shared courtyard back into our houses. But a roof seems to have a different status. And this first Mishnah of chapter 9 is all about that. And as we heard, with respect to rooftops, Rabbi Meir said, if you imagine, especially kind of an older city where there's lots and lots of houses that have rooftops at approximately the same level and very narrow streets, and you could walk, across the rooftops. You could actually go from one place to another in the city over the rooftops. And Rabbi Meir says that even if these houses below the rooftops have not formed an Eruv so that they could carry between the houses or through their courtyards down at ground level, nevertheless, if the rooftops are all at approximately the same level and bordering on each other, then we may carry objects that started outside on Shabbos, like vessels that are allowed to be picked up on Shabbos. We can carry them from rooftop to rooftop, even in the absence of an Eruv. And Rav said, no, absolutely not. You can only carry an object 4 cubits in any direction which is the same rule as there's no Eruv and you're in a public domain, you can only carry an object 4 cubits. Rooftop is the same to Rav here in this Mishnah as it would be to just be out there in somewhere general in the city in the public domain. Shmuel says with regard to rooftops, we can carry throughout a rooftop. It's not just 4 cubits, but anywhere in the rooftop, but we cannot carry from one rooftop to another. And the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir seem to agree with Shmuel because they say each roof is its own domain. So you can carry around the rooftop more than the 4 cubits, but you can't carry from one rooftop to another. And then in the same Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon says, actually, you can carry throughout the rooftops, you can carry throughout the courtyards, and you can carry throughout the enclosures, and from one to another, any vessel that began outside in one of these types of spaces, a rooftop, courtyard, or enclosure, it's like they're all one master domain. You can carry around all of them. It's a huge leniency compared to Rabbi Meir, Rav, Shmuel, the rabbis. Tremendous leniency. How is it possible that they came out in such a different place? That is what we are learning now. So, in understanding how we got there, Abaye says, so imagine that there's a rooftop, just a single rooftop for now. There's a rooftop that's joined to other rooftops. But on one of these particular rooftops, the homeowner that lives beneath the roof built a structure on the roof, right? It's like he built an additional floor on the roof, an additional floor of his house with walls and an extra ceiling. So now there's a higher, small roof above all the other rooftops. He probably has an interior stairway. He can get up there. So there's a structure up there. And opposite the door of this structure, which opens out onto the roof, he makes a partition, some kind of a partial partition. I say partial because he doesn't surround his rooftop. He just puts a fence, a straight fence, sort of a few steps away from the door, presumably so that a person could step out of the door and not take a few steps in the dark and fall off the roof. But because that partial partition is there and it doesn't enclose his rooftop, says Abaye, this person has signaled that he wants to use the rooftops, right? He's got a structure up there. It has a door that opens up to the rooftop. He didn't enclose his whole rooftop. Therefore, what he's signaling is he wants to go out of that structure, use the rooftop as a space, as a living space, and have access to the neighboring rooftops. For this person, he acquires the right to carry objects on Shabbos around all those rooftops. But he does so because it's almost like a single house in a private courtyard where you don't need an Eruv and you can carry in and out of the house. This person acquires that right because nobody else has signaled a similar desire to carry on those rooftops, to occupy those rooftops. So it's like all the rooftops are his to use in terms of carrying on Shabbos. It's not like he's actually acquiring property. He doesn't own anybody else's property. He just has the ability, the right, the legal right to carry objects on Shabbos without being restricted in the absence of an Eruv, says Abaye. Rami Bar Chama says a new question. He says, may we carry 2 cubits on the roof and 2 cubits on an adjoining portico? All right, let's understand this question that Rami Bar Chama is asking. So first of all, he says 2 cubits here and 2 cubits there. So what he's talking about the ruling of Rav, that you only can carry 4 cubits on a rooftop, right? Rav said you can only carry 4 cubits. But what he's asking is, can you split those 4 cubits between your rooftop and an adjoining rooftop? Now, he's adding an extra level of complexity because he says the neighboring rooftop, the adjoining rooftop, is not the roof of a residence. Rather, it's a portico, which means it's just a roof held up by posts, but there's no residence under it. And as we've seen, a portico is not a residence. You can't live in a portico. It's just a roof that you put over a garden type of situation, so you have some shade when you want to, maybe have a meal out there. So is this going to be permitted? Now, according to Rav, I'm sorry, are we talking about Rava or Rav? I just confused myself. Hold on a second. I think it's Rav, but I just want to make sure, because now my notes have confused me. Hold on one second. I'm pretty sure it's Rav. Yeah, very good. According to Rav, you only get 4 cubits on the roof. But can you split those cubits between your roof and an adjoining roof? It was to this question that the rabbi said each roof is its own domain. So it's possible that the rabbis were not agreeing with Shmuel, who said you can carry anywhere around the roof, much more than 4 cubits, anywhere around the roof. And it seemed that the rabbis were agreeing with Shmuel when they said each roof is its own domain. Perhaps they were agreeing with Rav, and they were saying you only get 4 cubits, and you cannot split those 4 cubits, between your roof and a neighboring roof. So it seems like you may not carry, at least per the opinion of Rav and the rabbis, you can't do 2 cubits on your roof and 2 cubits on the neighboring portico. But what about the fact that it's a portico? Right? Now that it's a portico, it's not a residence. So even if you can't carry 2 cubits on your roof and 2 cubits on the neighboring roof, maybe you can when it's 2 cubits on your roof and 2 cubits over this portico. So to address this question, Rav Bevai bar Abaye says, well, can we carry 2 cubits on this roof and 2 cubits on the neighboring roof if the neighboring roof is a ruin, right? So it was a residence. It's fallen into disrepair. Nobody lives there now. It's not really fit for habitation because it's all broken down, but there is a roof still there. Can we make that transition? 2 cubits here, 2 cubits there. Rav Kahana says to Rav Bevai, it's the same question as 2 cubits on this roof and 2 cubits on the portico, the roof next door that has no residence under. And Rav Bevai has a beautiful answer to Rav Kahana. You can really hear what the sages were like, their personalities when they would interact with each other. These are all incredibly learned guys who challenge each other constantly, but don't like to be underestimated. So Rav Bevai Barabaria says to Rav Kahana, did I come late to the study hall merely to quarrel with you? In other words, do you think that I'm the type of person who arrives late at the study hall, doesn't hear the whole discussion, hears one little thing, and then inserts a question just for the purpose of quarreling, even though he doesn't know where the state of the discussion has been until now? Obviously, I'm thinking that it's not the same question whether the 2 cubits on the adjoining roof are over a portico or over a residence, because a portico was never fit to be a residence, and the ruin was a residence, is a residence. It simply doesn't have residence there now. It's fallen into disrepair, but it has the status of a residence. That's why I said a ruin is different than a portico, and that's why I asked this question. So the Gemara answers, well, Rabbi Beva, you're getting all incensed, but if it's a residence, then it's the same question that we had before, that you cannot transfer, you can't carry 2 cubits on this roof and 2 cubits on the neighboring residence, per the opinion of Rav and the rabbis, that each roof is its own domain and you can only carry 4 cubits total. He would answer, well, these are 3 different types of buildings. There's a portico, there's a residence, and there's a ruin. A ruin is like a residence, but it's also devoid of inhabitants right now, and that's why I asked the question. And what is the answer? Teku. Let it stand. Sometimes they have a big debate, and they just leave it unanswered. Now, one of the important reasons why this particular debate was left unanswered is because the law is not like the rabbis, it's not like Rav, and it's not like Shmuel. Ultimately, the law is going to come out like Rabbi Shimon, who's going to say, yeah, you can carry throughout more than the 4 cubits on any rooftop and rooftop to rooftop, but we're not there yet. But on this question of splitting the 2 cubits here and the 2 cubits there, it's not going to really matter because the law isn't going to come out that way. Nevertheless, we should understand that very often the rabbis will say, well, the law may be like X, and not like the minority opinion of Y, right? Rabbi X, the law is like Rabbi X. It's not like the minority opinion of Rabbi Y, but right now we're having a discussion according to the opinion of Rabbi Y. So according to that opinion, how would it come out? And it's very interesting that the rabbis do that, because if you think, why sort of work out what the answer would be according to a minority opinion with, according to which we don't hold? Why would you work out these questions? Because one day the minority opinion might actually turn out to be the law, and then we'll be prepared. And it is definitely the case that the sages believe, they say this elsewhere, but when Mashiach comes, when we get to the Messianic age, there will be many rulings which were minority rulings in our world where they were not practical because we don't live in a place where God's presence is fully revealed, and we have access to exact measures and better insight into the will of God like we will when God's presence is revealed throughout the world in the Messianic age. Then there are many minority rulings that will become the law, and having had these discussions in the thousands of years in between, we'll be ready when that day comes. But on this question, teku, they let it stand. Now comes a new question. So with regard to a bunch of roofs that are on the same level per Rabbi Meir, or an isolated roof. So it's not adjoining the nearby roofs, it's an isolated roof. Rav says you can carry throughout. Now this is a Baraisa, not a Mishnah. Now probably Rav is addressing not all the roofs that adjoin each other. He's probably addressing the second part of this statement with regards to a roof that doesn't have adjoining roofs next to it. Rav says you can carry throughout that roof, and Shmuel says you can only carry 4 cubits. Whoa, wait a minute. We just learned that when the roofs are adjoining a bunch of other roofs, Rav says you can only carry 4 cubits within any one roof. And Shmuel said you can't carry from roof to roof, but you can carry anywhere around the whole rooftop. Now that we're talking about a roof that is isolated from other roofs, why does Rav say you can carry throughout the roof, and now Shmuel says only 4 cubits? It seems like their opinions have switched, and they're not consistent with their own opinions in the first case. They said the opposite. So why? So the Gemara says, they have good reasons for switching their opinions in this way. Rav could say to you, when there's an isolated roof, okay, so now we know that this roof is on top of a house, and it's conspicuous and clear where the walls of the house that are below that rooftop, where they are, right? Because you could see the edge of the roof is where the wall that's beneath it is standing. Whereas sometimes when you have, especially one of these older cities, and the rooftops are all kind of on the same level, it's not so clear where one roof begins and the other ends. So he's saying since it's conspicuous where the walls of the house below the roof are standing, we extend them upward as if they were parapets around this roof and 10 handbreadths high, presumably. And so that makes an enclosure, and we can carry anywhere around in that enclosure on Shabbos. Now, what would Shmuel say? Why does Shmuel now say only 4 cubits in such a rooftop? And he might say to you, I'm talking about a rooftop that is a large rooftop. It's bigger than 2 base sa, right? So we've discussed what that is before. It's basically something that's 50 cubits by 100 cubits, 5,000 square cubits or more. And when you have an enclosure of that size that was not originally enclosed as a residence, and as we've seen, rooftops are considered a different domain than the homes beneath them. Different domain than the homes beneath them. Unless you put a structure up there with a door out onto the roof, and you're going to sort of populate your roof and put out some nice chairs and tables, etc. Forget the tables and chairs. They don't discuss that. But you have to signal your intention that you're going to actually use that space as a dwelling. If you don't do that, they're a separate domain. So, says Shmuel, now we're talking about a large rooftop that was not enclosed as a residence. And as we know, that's called a karpef, an enclosure. And you cannot carry there on Shabbos more than 4 cubits in any direction. Our final case, I'm going to go through it quickly. So if you have questions or comments, please put them in the comments now. I am coming to your questions and comments now. Final case, and this is interesting, and it's a nice place to finish because it's going to bring us back to Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. So what about a ship? The opinions of Rav and Shmuel with respect to an isolated rooftop appear to be consistent with their opinions with regard to a person who's on a ship at sea on Shabbos. Rav says you can carry objects all around the ship on Shabbos. Shmuel says you can only carry objects 4 cubits. Why? According to Rav, you can carry throughout because the sides of the ship act as partitions, which make an enclosure, and therefore you can carry all around the ship. Shmuel says the sides of the ship are the sides of the ship. They're not partitions meant to enclose an area for residential purposes, and people live on the ship, right? While they're there, they're living on the ship. But the sides of the ship were not created as an enclosure to enclose for residential purposes. The sides of the ship are there to keep the water out, says Shmuel. And so we can't consider them to be partitions. And therefore, you can only carry 4 cubits if you're on a ship at sea on Shabbos. Rav Chia bar Yosef said to Shmuel, and what is the law? Now, Shmuel just said, according to me, I hold that you can only carry 4 cubits. But when Rav Chia bar Yosef said to Shmuel, what is the law? He said, the law is like Rav. Because his reasoning is more convincing. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? His reasoning is more convincing than mine. He himself still holds the way that he holds. Maybe he received a tradition. Maybe he learned it that way from his master. Maybe he has good, solid reasons for holding that way. But he says the law is according to Rav because his reasoning is more convincing. Would that we had leaders in the world in the year 2020 who, when faced with rationales for laws and policies that are different than their own, they could hear it and say, yeah, that's more convincing than my argument, and the law should be according to my opponent. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, if you're joining us now, former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom. We lost him today at the age of 72. He's a great, great Torah light. And what was amazing about him is that he never issued a ruling. He never gave an interpretation of Torah without spelling out precisely the steps that he used to arrive at his reasoning, the steps with which he arrived at his understanding of the verse or the teaching. And he made it so crystal clear that you felt like how could you have ever understood that verse before? What Rabbi Sacks brought just seems so foundational, so clear, so basic. You can't believe you never heard it before. And so many of his teachings have that quality. They're not just beautiful. They're not just heartfelt. They're not just good. But they are reasonable and crystal clear and carry their reasons with them. May his memory always be for a blessing, and may we continue to learn from him. Let me come to your questions and comments. Are there any? It's not coming through over here. Hold on a second. I thought I saw some before. Okay, Okay, I see Nina's having a conversation with people who watched her challah bake. If you missed Nina's challah bake on Thursday, that was our Thursday show in place of AT Daily. She taught how she makes challah, both the physicality of it, how she makes it. It's the most delicious challah in the world. I highly recommend you check out her recipe and her skills and how to do it, but also her intentionality and spirituality that goes into her challah making. It was amazing. It was a great show, and obviously people loved it because they're still talking about it, and that is awesome. Okay, but it looks like... Whoop, just checking. Was I signed out of our document for questions? Sharon Frant Brooks says, good question, Sharon. How can there be a roof without a parapet? Isn't that a Torah commandment to have one? Exactly. That is a biblical commandment that if you have a house, your roof has to have a parapet, has to have a wall surrounding it so that people don't just walk off the roof and kill themselves by mistake. So it's a very good question. How is it that these rooftops don't have clearly demarcated walls? I don't really understand that, Sharon. It seems like perhaps it's a hypothetical case, or perhaps what they're talking about is it was almost like apartment buildings where the residents of the buildings didn't have access to the roofs. So they weren't building parapets up there because it wasn't really part of their living space. You know, like you would think, well, everybody has access to the rooftop, but I don't know. Maybe in the ancient world, there were situations where particular buildings didn't have access to the rooftop, and that's why it really was like another domain up there. Otherwise, I can't quite understand it. Because I would think, I don't know, I haven't researched this question, but I would think that a parapet, in order to qualify as a parapet, would also have to qualify as a mechitza, as a partition, and be at least 10 handbreadths high. But perhaps the issue is that even though they're of that height, they're thin, maybe they're just a railing, and maybe that does not count as a division between the rooftops for the purposes of carrying, even though it might count for the purposes of safety. However, it does seem like they would be conspicuous. So those who are talking about that there's a lack of being conspicuous as a division between rooftops, that might be an issue there. It's a great question. And Sharon finally says, Rabbi Soloveitchik had a similar Eruv issue regarding the Eruv in New York City dealing with the seawall around the city. Exactly. So when you're talking about community Eruvs, it's another question. And there we're talking about all kinds of structures can be used, even fishing line from pole to pole. But where it gets interesting is that using existing structures, and the seawall was a question. Is it high enough above the water? Is it high enough above the ground where the people encounter it to count? Perhaps there was a railing there, but it was not a wall that could be used as an enclosure. So perhaps that's what you're talking about. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us this evening. It's great to learn with you. Our learning tonight is dedicated to the honor and the memory of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. May the memory always be for a blessing. May our learning of his words tonight give him a little extra merit and raise his soul even a little higher, where it's already, really high, perched next to the throne of the Holy One, no doubt. All the best and have a great week, my holy sisters and brothers.